Thank you all for coming out on a Sunday afternoon. I'm Atul Gawande, and I'm with the New Yorker magazine. And I'd like to welcome all of you to the New Yorker Festival and to this particular event. This is the 10th New Yorker Festival, and today's talk that I'll be giving to you is called The Death of a Master Builder, a story of risk, medicine, and skyscrapers. It's a story that comes from a new book that I just finished and will have coming out in late December. And so for that reason, it's still feeling a little rough around the edges. I'm still thinking my way through it. But I hope you'll bear with me while I try to tell you the story. The impetus for telling this story is in trying to think about where our struggles are coming from in medicine. And where I think they come from, both for patients and for doctors, is not in the end from the money, although that's what's dominating the discussion these days. It's not from the insurance hassles. It's not from the malpractice lawsuits, although all those things complicate the job of providing good care for people. Instead, I think it comes from the complexity of what's required, the complexity of what's required to provide treatments that can, for any kind of condition that can afflict the human body. More than 13,000 different kinds of diagnoses, and trying to organize the care that's supposed to provide what are now more than 6,000 drugs, more than 4,000 different kinds of medical and surgical procedures. It is arguably the most complex industry there is. There is no part of our economy that needs to deliver 13,000 different service lines, community by community, with the kind of range of complexity that doing things right involve here. I also think that those struggles with complexity extend well beyond medicine. They are a very modern struggle that we have with grappling with the know-how, with the amount of knowledge that science and technology has deposited upon us. And in order to tell the story about medicine, I would ask your forbearance, because I think the way that we might be able to get at it is with a story not about medicine, but the story of a building. I was walking down the street to my hospital, coming to work one day, just a couple years ago. And it was early 2007. And I came across, as I walked down Francis Street in front of our hospital, a place where there used to be a just wide open pile of dirt. And then suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, there was now an 11-story structure of steel girders that had seemed to fill up the entire block. We'd known for a couple of years a building was going up, but here suddenly it was, stretching out of the ground. And as I watched a worker walking across one of the girders about 4 stories up and then settling down to work welding a joint in one of the girders that was going to be the skeleton for this building, what I'd wondered was, how did he know that he was building this thing right? How did he know that this building wouldn't just fall down? This building was not unusually large. It was intended to be a new wing for our hospital. It was going to have 200 new hospital beds and 16 new operating rooms, which I was particularly looking forward to. The previous year, I would bet you a dozen larger buildings had gone up in and around New England. And yet, this one was not a small task. The real estate manager was able to give me a few statistics about it. It was going to be 350,000 square feet in size. It was going to cost $360 million. It was going to have 3,885 tons of steel. It had 13,000 yards of concrete that they would require, 19 air handling units, its own emergency backup generator, 64,000 feet of copper piping, 95 miles of electric wire. And the whole time I'm thinking, as he's saying all this to me, oh yeah, and this thing's not supposed to fall down? When I was 11 years old, growing up in Athens, Ohio, I decided I wanted to build myself a bookshelf. And so my mother gave me $10, and I biked down Richmond Avenue to the C&E hardware store, and I talked to the nice guy behind the counter with the hairy ears and explained to him what I wanted to do. And he supplied me with a little tin of stain and a tin of varnish and 4 plywood boards that were cut to about 4-foot lengths, just the right width for books. And so I took my little pile and figured out how to trundle this stuff home on my bike, and then went into my garage and hammered these boards together. So we had 2 on the side and then 2 center boards in the middle. Banged them all together, propped it right up, looked pretty good, stained it and varnished it, brought it to my room, put 6 books on it, and then watched the whole thing tip over like a drunk. So I propped it back up again, decided to hammer in some more nails at an angle, kind of trying to get a little more purchase working here, and it tipped over the other way. I went at this for a while, and then finally I just nailed the damn thing to the wall. And that was how I discovered the concept of bracing. And so when I was thinking about what they were needing to do as they built this structure, this high-rise, massive building, I realized there were 2 components to the puzzle of how they knew that this thing was going to stand up straight. First was the question of how did they know the right thing to do? How did they have the right knowledge? And how did that knowledge arrive at this particular corner of Vining and Francis Street in Boston in 2007? So that's number one. How do they know what the right thing to do is? And then the second was, how do they know that they're executing that knowledge correctly? Both were tricky. The design, I presumed, would have all kinds of considerations, like what the makeup of the steel is and how tall the building had to be and what the soil composition in the area was. And then the difficulties of turning the plans into reality were, you could have some fantastic plans on paper, but how do you know that the tradesmen, with all their different ways of doing things, were going to do all of that correctly, that they would have the right machinery, that have the right setup, that they would be doing this in the right way, at the right time, in the right sequence. And yet, somehow, the building world succeeds. We put up hundreds of thousands of buildings around the United States each year, a total of about 70,000 high-rise buildings and several million low-rise buildings. And the number that actually fall down from structural failure are fewer than 20 in a year. It's the kind of performance in the face of that complexity that we would be very jealous for in medicine. And so to try to answer this question, I went to visit a guy named Joe Salvia. He was the structural engineer for the project, 62 years old, very easygoing, kind of a, sit down, have a coffee with me kind of guy, not the kind of engineer. He was not a reticent engineer type. He was more than happy to tell me the stories of what he does. And he was very good at what he does. He is someone who has worked on nearly all of the hospital projects in and around Boston, building virtually every wing and unit in the city. He built Fenway Park, including the Green Monster, the 37-foot home run stealing wall in our left field. He built the 5,000 hotel room MGM Grand out in Las Vegas. He's built, his highest skyscraper is an 80-foot skyscraper in southern Florida. They have projects all over the world and have developed a specialty in complex high-rise structures. And what he was particularly good at as a person was at being able to solve complex problems himself. He is the son of a meat packer and a housewife. He grew up in Cambridge, in East Cambridge. This is not exactly where the Harvard faculty live, and was the first one in his family to go to college. But he explained that when he went to college, he turned out to be very good at math. He described along the way in one of our conversations how to solve a quadratic equation in your head, and all I could think as he was talking was I'd never heard someone say quadratic equation in a Boston accent before. So I asked him, how do you know how to make a building stand up straight? And what he told me about was a project that was one of the very first projects he had. It was building a mall roof for a structure in Texas. And he explained that when he first got assigned this project, there was a great deal he already knew. He had gone to Tufts and majored in engineering, and the basics were already laid out in his textbooks. You have to follow the building codes on steel strength, on soil composition, on wind pressure that had to be withstood, what the earthquake tolerances are. Then the textbooks would tell you about the particular geometry and ways that you could construct a roof, the different options that you might have, and if you matched it to what the building codes were suggesting, you had a set of options that you could choose from. And then you would factor these considerations that you got from the textbooks and the building codes into the business deal. The business deal would have a basic layout of what the mall was supposed to look like. How many stores, roughly what size the stores are supposed to be, how many loading docks there were. And into this, you would come out with a kind of equation. You put all the factors in, and out came some estimates that, well, I would put columns every 30 feet to support the structure. And as we're talking about this, he actually got out a piece of paper and began drawing the contours out for me. It was a rectangular mall he was imagining. And then he showed me everywhere that you could place a column to support the structure going up top. But then he quickly learned that all of this was not nearly enough. The first concern was that the plans he had pulled together didn't take into consideration costs, and no one had really explained that to him before. The steel he had chosen in that first mall roof turned out to be more expensive than the owner wanted to consider using, and so he needed to make adjustments for that. Second of all, there was the matter of aesthetics, and nobody wanted a column to go in the middle of the floor or to block a particular sight line. Then you had the considerations of just making it even look pretty, not just sit in the wrong place, but a particular look that they wanted to have. Later in his career, he worked on a Philip Johnson skyscraper called International Place in Boston. And this is a 46-story steel and glass structure that had an unusual shape because what it did was jammed a cylindrical shape together with a rectangular shape. And that structure hadn't really been built before. One of the reasons you don't see many cylindrical buildings around is because they turn out to have less structural resistance than buildings that are in a square. And he explained to me that a circular structure has 60% less stiffness for resisting wind than square structures or rectangular structures. And they needed to figure out how to handle the bracing and solve this problem, which had not really been posed in architecture before. Even on this small mall roof, he found that he had to begin to encapsulate all of these different permutations and complexities that hadn't been taught to him. So besides cost, and besides needing to account for and adjust the structure to meet the aesthetic needs of what the team wanted, there was also the matter of what all the other people involved in building the structure required. On that project, you had plumbers, you had electricians, you had mechanical engineers, and all of them were wanting to put wiring and an HVAC unit and piping exactly where he wanted the columns to go. He explained to me that a building is like a body. It has a skeleton, that's the frame. It has a nervous system, that's the electrical systems. It has a vascular system with the piping and so on. It has a skin on the outside. Over time, it has evolved that there are, in fact, 16 different kinds of trades that are all involved in a building. And like a human being, each building is individual. It has its particularities. Now, with 16 different trades, ranging from everybody from the elevator engineers who handle the egress up and down, to the masonry people, to the plumbers, and so on, all of these people have to be accommodated. All of them have to somehow make a structure that fits together. And as he enumerated all of those considerations, the complexities really seemed to me impossible to handle. So how did they do that? Well, that was where the story got particularly interesting to me. In order to handle all of these complexities, the skyscraper industry, he explained, had to evolve. They had to move away from a model that they used to have called the master builder. The master builder is the strategy of making a structure or a building in the head of one person who is responsible for everything from the design to the engineering to the construction of this whole facility. And this has been the way we have built buildings going back to medieval times. St. Peter's Basilica, Notre Dame, the U.S. Capitol, these were all built by master builders. But by the 1930s, the master builder was dead and gone. First thing that happened was that the complexity and the knowledge involved with making more and more sophisticated buildings, larger and larger buildings with different kinds of detail and different kinds of structure, led architecture to break off from engineering and construction. And then soon engineering broke off from the construction trades. And then within each, you began to have subspecialties. Subspecialties within architecture for doing everything from making green buildings, for example, to being able to handle not just energy requirements, but earthquake proofing and so on. Engineering has broken into its subspecialties, and then so has the construction world. It has become a cacophony of overwhelming variety, sophistication, and super specialization. There were so many specialties that there was no possible way a single master builder could hold this all in their head and get it all right for the client. Does that sound at all familiar to you? We in medicine are still living in our equivalent of the master builder era. We are in the world of the master physician, where one person is responsible for really thinking about all of the considerations of care for a person as they take on a particular disease or diagnosis or injury. We've been slow to adapt to the reality that we too have become a division of multiple specialties, trying to make, where the knowledge has become so dense and overwhelming that your ability to make any one thing go right has required us to divide into not just surgeons and pediatricians and internists and radiologists, but in fact super specialized. I'm a general surgeon, but there's really no such thing. My particular area is increasingly in cancer surgery and even within cancer surgeries, especially in tumors of endocrine glands. Likewise, you don't meet a radiologist these days. You'll meet a radiologist who might specialize in breast radiology or cardiac echocardiography. And so, as we have watched our world evolve into increasing specialty, we have reached a point where our failures are routine, despite the advancements in what we have been able to do. Our capabilities have allowed for incredible possibility, but we have also watched where our difficulties of both failure and cost, from everything from duplications to just letting things fall between the cracks, have been routine. By the end of life, the average American now has more than 10 physicians involved in their care in that last year of life. We probably have at least a score more mid-level professionals involved. And a sign of just how difficult it's been to make sure that everybody does their job correctly is take a look and see how often we've been able to make sure we just wash our hands. 2 million people will pick up infections in hospitals around the country just because somebody didn't wash their hands. And 100,000 people will die as a result. Now, the difference between us and the building industry is that we kill people one at a time, and when a building goes down, it all happens at once. And so what Joe Salvia told me is that the level of failure that he sees when he goes to a hospital is simply intolerable in his line of work. Maybe it's the publicity, maybe it's the lawsuits, maybe it's just the way that the culture has evolved in that world. But he learned very quickly with that first small roof that failure was not an option. And so he was, and so not just he, the whole industry had been forced at the start of the 20th century to confront the reality that the master builder, as a model for how to do things, was a failure. And so they abandoned it. And so I asked him, now, how do you make things go right if you no longer have someone in the middle of it all who understands everything that needs to be done? And to explain it, he took me down the street from his offices to one of his many projects. This one is called the Russia Wharf Tower. It's a 32-story complex, 700,000 square feet. The footprint for this alone is 2 acres. And on the day I arrived to see what it was like, the insides had already been gutted from the prior building that had been there, a 19th century building on which they were preserving the old facade. And it had been built. The skeleton had gone up to the 14th floor. You could see the tower crane hanging over it, another 4 stories above. And as we crawled past the police barricades, diverting the traffic, and the cranes and bulldozers and everything else moving in, he took me into the field office, which was on the 1st floor of this complex. And there I met Finn O'Sullivan, 6'3" project executive, as they call them. They don't call them field bosses anymore. And inside, where you would think you'd hear a staticky radio and rusting, and you'd see a rusting coffee urn, this was not like the movie script picture of what the field office was like. Instead, it was dotted with half a dozen or more people, in, mostly young people, in yellow reflector vests and hard hats, sitting at computers, entering information, or sitting in the conference room around a PowerPoint presentation. And what Finn O'Sullivan explained to me was his job, was that on any given day, he has between 200 and 500 workers on site, from 60 subcontractors as well as those he employed himself. They represented all 16 of the major trades, and in the midst of it all, he barely understood the details of any of it. And yet he was supposed to make it all go right. So how did he do it? Well, he took me to his conference room to show me. And there, along one wall, he showed me was a giant checklist. It was a line-by-line, day-by-day explanation of what he just called his schedule. But on it was everything detailing the most mundane things, like the fact that the steel had to be delivered before you moved the tower crane in, that the flooring on one floor should be attended to before you got the masonry guys coming in. And as each were accomplished, they had a little red mark which he'd put in his computer, and it would check off that this thing was accomplished day by day. Now, this checklist was drawn up by a group. It was drawn up by bringing all of those trades together and having them sort out what were all the jobs that they were going to need to be done, and how do they make sure each of them were accomplished. The people who came along to this included Joe Salvia, and they vetted through this succession of checks, the succession of day-by-day checks, in such a way that you could ensure that the knowledge of hundreds of people, even thousands, had arrived in the right time at the right place. And so, as you watch this building go together, what you were really seeing was a series of people working through something as simple as a mundane checklist. Now, you could see the building being built up in layers the way that this checklist laid it out, just by going up into it. One of the engineers took me up on this rattling orange cage elevator to the top, and I should tell you, I don't do very well with heights. But we arrived on the 14th floor, which was this vast slab of concrete that had been poured to serve as the floor. The steel girders, steel beams standing up around side, and then that was it, just Boston all around us. The engineer went out to the edge, and I have a hard time with that being even 3 feet right there. And he said, "You got to see this over here, Atul. This is such a great view." And I would stand maybe about this close, and still felt like I was going to fall over. I did much better when we turned our back to the city, and he started showing me exactly what was going on in the building. So first, that went up was the bracing. Metal braces that were sitting in the ceiling to support the structure. And he explained to me that the fireproofers would be coming next to put the fireproofing on the braces. I didn't understand that metal braces would need fireproofing, but he explained that they actually do. That if there is a fire, steel can bend like a noodle. It plasticizes, and that this was in fact what brought the World Trade Center down. It exceeded the heat of the jet fuel, had exceeded even the tolerances of the fireproofing material. So then we went down to the second floor. He took me down took me down these concrete stairs with no railings, and we then saw the fireproofing had been applied, this kind of fluffy gray stuff. And then went down another floor, and you could begin to see that the pipe fitters had laid in pipes. And then you go to the next floor, and the tin knockers had come through. I'd never heard of tin knockers, but I just love the word. The tin knockers had come in and put in the ducting for the ventilation. And then as we went down, there started to be railing on the stairways, and then there was some masonry going up. The skin of the building had gone in, the outer sort of shiny mirror-like look that the building was going to have. And by the time we got down to the first floor, you were seeing already the details of the banisters on the staircases and everything else coming in. It had been a process that had unfolded in this incredible way, step by step, despite the fact that nobody sat in the middle of it really understanding all of the details. There was nobody who was the all-knowing, omniscient master builder. There was just a master checklist. The criticism I had of taking this approach, I said to them, was that, how do you possibly apply this idea to a world like medicine, where you are constantly faced with unpredictable problems. People don't follow the textbooks. What you think is going to happen is only a bet. I'm going to give an antibiotic for pneumonia, but things may not get better, and then you need to adjust along the way. You cannot make a checklist for somebody for their care in ways that would suggest that you could just plan it all out on advance and then just get a bunch of people to execute on it. Medicine doesn't work that way, and most things we do that have any degree of complexity really don't work that way. But their response was, that's exactly what happens when you're building a building as well. There are unpredictable problems all the time. And I ran across one when I was up there on that 14th floor taking a look around. Even with my unschooled eyes, I could see that there was water pooling around the center of the building. In the center of the building was a huge, heavy concrete core, and then you had the slab flooring all around, and then the steel beams ringing the edges. And water had pooled on the inside in the middle around that concrete core as if the building had become a bowl, and the floor was tilting. And so I asked the engineer, I said, what's going on with the water pooling that way? Is the floor tilted? And he said, yeah, the owners weren't too happy about that one. He said, you know, I think probably what's going to happen is that it will all settle out. The concrete core and the soil in the area was just a little moister than they expected, and so the concrete core had settled a couple of inches, and the outer sides hadn't, because you hadn't yet put the full 32-story structure on top to begin weighting it down. But when it is loaded, he was quite convinced, he was pretty convinced, that it would all settle out okay. I say pretty convinced. He said, oh, I'm totally sure it's fine. I said, well, is it possible that it may not level out? He said, well, variances can occur. Now, the interesting thing was not really his explanation to me, because I didn't know how much to believe, whether his explanation was right or not right. The interesting thing to me was how they handled the explanation. The medical model for how you handle this situation is you turn to an expert. You turn to the equivalent of the engineer who was explaining to me what they thought about this situation. You turn to a super specialist. They give you their judgment, and then you go with it. You either go with it or you don't. Maybe you get a second opinion, and now you got two completely different opinions, and you still have to pick which one you're going to go with or not. That was not the way they did it. Instead, the trouble with doing that, they pointed out to me, is that the medical way is autonomy. And autonomy, in a world where you have 16 trades and potentially dozens of unexpected problems that crop up in a structure as you're going along and you're building this massive thing, autonomy results in chaos. Individual people making what seem like really smart decisions, but they don't fit together at all. And without a master builder, without a omniscient, all-knowing person who can see everything fitting together, autonomy ends up being a complete cacophony. You have incompatible decisions, you have problems overlooked, you have self-interest jumping in, you have costs that start skyrocketing. And it sounded a lot to me like medicine at its worst. So what did they do? That was when we were back down in the field office. Finn O'Sullivan showed me the other side of his conference room. Along the right-hand wall had been the schedule, which was a line-by-line checklist of all the tasks people had to do. But on the left-hand wall of that conference room was another checklist. Except this one was not a list of the tasks people had to do. This was a list of the communications tasks that people had to do. Because the way they solved these kinds of problems is they just made sure people talked. And so in advance, they could predict that there very likely may be various problems of different kinds. We just don't know what they're going to look like. So when the elevators go in, by the end of that month, they wanted the elevator engineers to review the plans with several of the other trades as well as the contractors to see, was there anything that we didn't expect that happened? And how are we going to solve this? Similarly, at the end of that month, they had a meeting planned for the review of the top 4 floors and their structure with multiple trades involved. And they would all sit around. And in fact, at that meeting, they discussed this problem. I asked Bernie Riard, the structural engineer who handled that discussion, how that had gone. He said it had gone fine. They had the different engineers and consultants sit down, and they didn't treat it like a second opinion where just one person says one thing, another says another, and the owner is supposed to make heads or tails of it. Instead, they made their best arguments to one another. They weighed how good the arguments were and whether people really had considered everything that should be in there. And then they reached a conclusion. They decided they needed to do something for water cleanup, and that meant a change in the schedule, and that meant some further downstream changes that they went ahead and fixed. But then second, they also said, from as best we can tell, we buy your arguments, Bernie Riard, and we're going to simply leave the plans as they are, and we're going to expect that, on the whole, this is likely going to level out. The way they dealt with the uncertain and the unexpected, the true complexity, there's complexity of 2 kinds. We have complexity just because you have a bunch of tasks, what the complexity theorists call complicated problems. When you want to put a rocket on the moon, you might be able to boil it down to a series of simple tasks. But you can't make a recipe for it. It has to have coordination. It has to have the specialists all together. And you have to have them begin talking to one another to make sure you're on the same page. There's a second set of problems that you have that the theorists call true complexity. It's like raising a child. Having knowledge of raising one child doesn't mean you'll be any good at raising the second. Experience helps, but is not enough. Each child is individual in ways that you have to adjust to the particular case. And so, like that problem in a building world, they take the approach of simply saying, I don't trust that one person can get this right, but I believe in the wisdom of a group of human beings to make sure that they have this right. And they take that far enough that they make an actual checklist of making sure not only that the tower crane came in at the right time, but that people have also spoken to one another before you move on to the next step. The belief in the wisdom of the group is fascinating in how far we're willing to take it. The risks that are involved in putting up skyscrapers seem crazy, and yet they were willing to apply this approach to almost any problem in its size or in its seriousness. One building that stuck out for me as an example of this is the story of the Citigroup building here in Manhattan. I believe it's on 53rd Street. It's the iconic tower that had been built in the 1970s that has a slanted roof and a base that has 4 pillars holding the building up, but the pillars are not at the corners. They're 9 stories high. They sit instead at the center of each side in order for there to be a church that sits right there underneath it. And when the builders started putting this 59-story building plan together, they made a model of this structure, and they tested it in a wind tunnel. And one of the things they found was that it sat so high up above the rest of Midtown Manhattan that it was subject to air turbulence that airplanes are used to seeing, but not buildings. The tolerances that they could find for how to deal with it were all from airplane manufacturing. The amount of acceptable sway for a building and wind force against it was not actually known for structures of that size. So how do you try to solve this problem? Well, first they turned to an expert to make a plan. And in fact, it turned out to be Salvia's partner, Robert McNamara, who had come up with a solution for this. It was a novel, ingenious idea. Hanging in the top of that building, he suggested, you would put a pendulum with a 400-ton concrete block that would just hang there from the equivalent of the bell tower. And if the wind blew one way, the concrete block would pull it the other, and that would keep it stabilized. In fact, that is what's up there right now, if you go up to the 59th floor and want to see what this looks like. Now, it's a fantastic idea, but the interesting thing is who in their right mind would let this thing go up in the middle of Manhattan with several thousand people inside, tens of thousands of people outside if this thing ever falls over? Well, there's no textbook you can turn to. There's no randomized trial to tell you that this is the best possible way to do this. All you have is an expert. So how did they deal with it? They had a meeting. They had a group of experts sit together and poke every hole they could in his argument for why this is a good way to build this building. They found that the calculations were sound. And rather than decide they're going to build a smaller building or one that is less ambitious, they went with it, and the city approved it. We, as a public, were willing to trust in experts, but the experts were smart enough to know that they shouldn't trust in themselves as individuals. They were willing to trust them in themselves as a group. And so they approved the building. It stands to this day. One of the interesting things was that there was a flaw. They had a checklist to make sure everybody communicated about the plan. The design looked perfect. Then Bethlehem Steel got the contract for actually doing the steel construction. And one of their proposals to the owners was that welding the key joints around the base of the building was a very expensive proposition. So they offered to do it at lower cost by bolting everything in. It was a subtle change, and according to their engineers' calculations, it looked perfectly fine. But they bypassed that meeting, having people simply talk about this one change. And so the lead structural engineer who came up with the concept of how you'd keep this building from falling under the force of the winds in New York City never got asked about it. It was only about 5 years later, after the building had been built and occupied, that an engineering student at Princeton sent a letter to Le Mesurier, the structural lead engineer, saying that his calculations seemed to show that the bolts he saw wouldn't hold in this building, and where did he make his mistake in his calculations? Mesurier wrote back and said, "Bolts? What bolts?" Sure enough, it turned out that the building, in the face of a 70-mile-an-hour wind, would topple, starting at the 30th floor. And a 70-mile-an-hour wind hits New York City about once every 55 years. Furthermore, that particular summer, Hurricane Emma was bearing down on New York City. This was an emergency. Le Mesurier is celebrated partly for the fact that he exposed that he admitted to the mistake that had been made along the way. He went to the city, and then the city decided that the public probably couldn't handle the news of this, and decided to fix the thing in secret. The New Yorker actually uncovered the story a couple years after the emergency. During the dead of night, they had welders go in after the building was unoccupied, so nobody knew about it. And they went through welding in place every one of the key joints until in time for Hurricane Emma. Now it turned out Hurricane Emma took a slightly diverted course. They were able to finish the welding by the end of the year. Problem averted until the New Yorker caught on to it. The lesson for medicine that comes out of this is that the practices are what we have neglected. We have focused on the drugs. We focused on the training and the specialization. But under conditions of extreme complexity, where solutions are uncertain, where knowledge is overwhelming, the best approach is not just to have the smartest possible specialist involved, nor is it, however, to try to centralize control, which is our natural instinct in the face of risk. When there is risk, people tend to say, oh my gosh, we have to make sure that we've planned everything from the middle and don't just leave everything to people and their judgment and what they want to do. Instead, what they do in the skyscraper industry is they disperse the control to the decision makers at the periphery, but they ensure then that there is a process in place where there is discipline, that people talk, that they measure their progress towards common goals. They have made the management of complexity a routine, and they've done it with the practical nuts and bolts of a checklist. That sense of commitment to the idea of making the whole is the fascinating and neglected part of medicine, and I think it is where our future lies. I, with a team, decided to take a look at an approach trying to follow this kind of lesson, and we applied it in a small way. We decided to make a surgery checklist, very much like the one they made in the construction world. We put it together just like the one in that conference room with the set of very fixed checks on one wall and the communication checks on the other. We saw that there were a handful of things that we could just start with that you had to do no matter what. Make sure an antibiotic gets in on time for a patient before you make an incision. Make sure that the blood is ready and for someone who might be at risk of a high blood loss. Make sure that critical X-ray imaging that you might need for the operation is already in the room before you start. But then also, because operations have more than just a handful of ways they can go wrong, operations have hundreds of ways that they can go wrong, many of which you can't predict in advance. Because of that, we made a different part of the checklist, which was simply to ask that the surgeon, the anesthesiologist, and the nurses introduce themselves to one another by name and role at the beginning of the operation, because we found an awful lot of the time they didn't even know each other's names. We had the surgeon brief the team on how much blood loss they should be prepared for, how long the operation might take, and anything else that they think might be pitfalls that people should know about. The anesthesiologist would we asked them to brief the team about the patient's condition and any concerns that they might have about the anesthesia or the patient. We asked the nurses to brief the team on their preparation of the equipment and anything else that they might be concerned about. We honed this down to being a 19-step short checklist, because in a skyscraper, you have a couple of years to build this thing. In an operation, minutes count. And so we honed it down to taking less than 2 minutes for a team to go through these routine checks. And then we implemented it in 8 hospitals around the world. We took this skyscraper idea and we applied it in both rich hospitals and in poor. We used it in cities ranging from the University of Washington Medical Center in Seattle. We took it to the University of Toronto Medical Center in Canada, St. Mary's Hospital in London, the University of Auckland in New Zealand. But then, because we see failures occurring at every level across the world, we also took it to 4 poor parts of the world. We implemented it in a very busy hospital in Delhi. We implemented it in a huge inner-city hospital in Manila, in a hospital in Amman, Jordan, handling a large volume of the refugees there, and also to a rural hospital in Tanzania. The checklist, we first measured the care for about 4,000 patients, and then we implemented the checklist. We had the teams just begin using this in their care and followed for another 4,000 patients. And we published the results of what we found this January in the New England Journal of Medicine. The average reduction in complications was 35%. The average reduction in deaths was 47%. The greatest benefit was in the poorest parts of the world. But in those 4 richest hospitals, which, by the way, we had chosen because even among wealthy countries, these are outlier hospitals with some of the best results even among the hospitals in their countries. Their average reduction in complications was 30%. If we implemented this kind of approach in multiple hospitals around the country, what we found was that the savings from this alone was $25 to $40 billion for the country. The interesting part of this is that it has been spreading. It's a very scalable idea from the skyscraper world. We can take it and introduce it in many, many places. And in fact, it has reached close to 1,000 of our 6,500 American hospitals over the course of this year. But it's been moving relatively slowly. It's been battling its way into operating rooms. Partly, it's the financial reasons, that although it saves a great deal of money, it's not the practitioners who get to see the benefit of that savings. In fact, the hospitals could lose money depending on the way they're paid, because if there are complications that lead to additional revenues, that money is gone. Now, I have not run into anybody who says, we're not implementing this because we'll lose money on this. But when you have that happen, it's certainly hard to invest in the headaches of getting the surgeons and anesthesiologists and nurses to all agree on taking a look at this checklist, adopting it, and getting it into place. I think, though, there is something deeper going on in what we see. There is a reason that there is a underlying resistance to trying this kind of regimented, disciplined approach taken from that skyscraper world. And we saw it in the fact that about 20% of the surgeons would refuse to use the checklist. They thought it was a waste of time. They thought it did not improve care. By the way, though, when we asked them that when we surveyed them, we also asked them, if you were having an operation, would you want the checklist to be used? 95% did. The trouble at the root of this is that there's a core idea missing here. If this was a drug, you would have ads clamoring for this to be put in place. You would have people battling with administrators to make sure that this was being supplied. But instead, what you have is something very unsexy. It's just a checklist. It doesn't seem like anything that you have worked all your career to learn how to handle and how to master. It is, I think, a missed chance for a culture of self-discipline that other fields have been able to adopt. And as we think about the opportunities here, it's not that we would just use this one surgery checklist. It's that we would begin to adopt this idea across many things we do, that we would think about it being in place for the care of a depression, the care of a patient who comes in with a heart attack, the care of a patient who is on dialysis. We can imagine that you begin to see costs become under better control, that you see quality significantly rise. And as you think about the hundreds of things that we do that are just as prone to failure as surgery, just as complex, pneumonias, suicide, chest pain, how a lung nodule is handled, what you run into is the fact that we are slow to embrace it because it runs counter to our idea of what it means to be good at what we do in the world. It runs counter to our beliefs about what it means to be, in fact, great under conditions of high stakes. We think that what you want is someone who has daring and courage and wits and not a checklist when you're in trouble and you need care. But I also think it's ludicrous to imagine that all of that gets eliminated. We will still need daring and courage and wits when we take on the complex problems that human beings have. And yet we also have to be ready for the virtues of regimentation. And I think at the core of it is our sense of whether we're heroes at what we do. And we have an image in mind of what it means to be heroic in our day-to-day work. But I think our idea of heroism needs to be updated. The day we released our result on January 14th of this year from the surgery checklist. And the very next day, just by coincidence, a U.S. Air Flight 1549 ended up losing both engines as geese flew into its engines, and it had to crash land onto the Hudson. It was the miracle on the Hudson the very next day. All of you, many of you probably saw it with your own eyes. It was considered by the National Transportation Safety Administration the most successful ditching of an airplane in aviation history because there was not a single life lost on board that day. Captain Chesley Sullensberger, otherwise known as Sully, has become hailed as a hero around the country. And within days, his hometown had organized a parade. The President Bush and President-elect Obama at that time both called him to congratulate him. Obama invited him and his family to his inaugural. He was given a $3 million book deal, the other thing we do for heroes. But within days, as the details of the process, of exactly what had happened came across, the procedures they followed, the checklists, the fly-by-wire computer system that helped guide the plane down, there became questions about who exactly was the hero here. Sully kept saying, "I want to correct the record. This was a crew effort. It was the result," he said, "of teamwork and adherence to procedure as much as skill." And what did we say? Aw, he's just being modest. The whole crew, after a few days, instead of just Sully, was invited by Mayor Bloomberg to New York City to get the keys to the city. And they all ended up providing exclusive interviews on each of the networks. They were all brought out for the opening of the Super Bowl in Tampa Bay. But you could see the press already having decided what the real story was here. Sully, they kept saying, "Sully, tell us, what was it like trying to fly that plane with the experience you had from your glider days as an Air Force cadet?" It was as if we could not really process what it took to save that plane. He replied, "Actually, I don't think there was anything I took from those days of flying gliders that helped me at all." The way I I looked at the details of what actually happened on that flight. And it felt remarkably like the world of the skyscraper. One thing to think about that stuck in my mind was that Sullenberger, who was the captain, and Jeffrey Skiles, who was the co-pilot, the first officer, had never flown together before they got on that plane that day. They both had tremendous experience. Skiles had something close to more than 25 years of experience as a captain in Boeing 737s, but because of downsizing, he'd been forced into the right-hand seat and into retraining to fly the Airbus A320, which was the plane that landed there. The idea that you have people of such tremendous experience really sounds great, but it isn't necessarily. Imagine having two really great basketball coaches arriving on the same day as the playoffs to coach one team, or two really great lawyers arriving to defend you in a trial on the very same day. It might work well, but it's even more likely that they will have a hard time just agreeing on what the proper things to do and what the strategy will really be. The way that flight went, however, they adhered to their rigid discipline. They went through their series of checks. Are the elevator controls in the right position? Are the flaps in the right position? And they went through a communication check. They made sure they'd been introduced to one another and to the crew as well. They made sure they discussed all contingencies, including what would happen if the engines should fail. They not only made sure that the plane was fit to fly, they had changed themselves from specialized individuals into a team that could make sure that that flight went as well as possible. And I think we have to think about how easy it would have been for them to blow that off that day. Checklists were created in the aviation industry in the 1930s, but right through the 1970s, and they'd been demonstrated to be incredibly valuable, but right through the 1970s, pilots routinely dismissed them. Senior pilots would say, we don't need to go through that day. But after enough crashes that occurred in the 1970s, they began to make a shift. Now, there was a real cultural battle over this. There was a fear that the rigidity of this kind of approach would actually make matters worse. People talked about the idea that people would be head down in their checklists as their plane plowed into a mountain, and that actually occurred once. But one of my favorite checklists that I've gotten to see was an engine restart checklist for a single-engine Cessna plane piloted by one person. And it goes through the details of what to do when that engine stops working. It has things you check on the fuel and on valves and so on. But number one on the checklist was fly the airplane. So the key decision when the geese hit and the engines went down was fly the airplane. But they even had a system for doing that. Sully took the controls, and he did it using, he had two key decisions. He took the controls, and he had to decide where to land, and neither one was all that hard. It was clear they were not going to, within about a minute, it was clear they were not going to make it to an airport, and so his best place, he decided, was the Hudson. And he decided to take the controls because the Manhattan was out his left-hand window, and he could see the George Washington Bridge and exactly what they needed to clear. And he had the most flight experience compared to Skiles, even though Skiles was experienced. He hadn't had as much experience in the A320. And so he said, my aircraft, using the language of the standard language that you use in this situation. And Skiles said, your aircraft. And he took the controls. The two of them were both crucial to this task. You needed both. Skiles arguably had the tougher job. The job of Sully was to guide the plane. The job of Skiles was to go through the checklists, mainly to try to restart the engines on the plane, There was a total of 3.5 minutes between the time that the plane lost its engines and they landed in the Hudson. And what they knew was their best chance of survival was going to be if they could get at least one of those engines started, because with that you could get to an airport. Now, the amount of time those checklists are designed to work in are where for people who are having this problem at much higher elevations. When they reran the simulation of what they went through, they had great difficulty getting pilots to be able to achieve what Skiles did. But he went through each of those checklists, got a solid engine restart attempt on both engines, and was able to confirm that neither engine was restartable. He then started on the ditching procedures, and he was able to make sure that the flight attendants were notified that they would be having to have a hard landing, and they were able to notify make sure that there was a early warning for the local airports to let emergency crew and others know that this was going on. Sully focused on the glide. There was a fly-by-wire computer system, and this computer system made it so he could pull the controls completely back, and it would set the plane's pitch in the right position for a great glide. It would keep radical angles from developing that would cause the plane to stall and just fall out of the sky. And that allowed him to focus on the key matter, which is the safest possible place to land. And he picked by being allowed to have that focus, he picked the right place, one very close to passenger ferries that could zoom in on that ice-cold day and pick them up. And then the flight attendants followed through on their procedures, their checklist of work to make sure that the life vests were distributed, that even though the plane, when it landed, started filling up with water and they had to wade through chest-high water from the back of the plane, that people were able to leave all of their belongings and get out the door. They evacuated that plane in 90 seconds, just the way that the procedures had been designed to do. The whole event went shockingly smoothly because of everything that people did. And then the question at the end is, who is the hero? There's no question it was miraculous. There was luck. There was, this was daylight, not nighttime. The bird strike was high enough that they could clear the George Washington Bridge. They were pointed downstream instead of upstream, and if they'd been upstream or out over the ocean, very likely the plane would have been destroyed. It was a clear day. And yet, for all of that, everything could have been lost. Instead, so there was, I think, without question, heroism. But what rescued them was something more exceptional, something more difficult, something more crucial, and I think heroic, than just flight ability. It was the crew's ability to adhere to procedure, to remain calm under pressure, to recognize where to improvise and where not to. They knew how to function in a complex and dire situation and understood it required teamwork and preparation. And it required all of that long before the situation became complex and dire. This was a crew that had a collective experience of more than 150 years. They had never remotely been in anything like this kind of accident conditions. They fully expected to retire, never facing conditions like these ever again, or ever, period. And yet, before that plane took off, they went through all their checks. They discussed, what do we do if the engines fail? And that struck me as being what was unusual. Those were the qualities, that willingness to have teamwork and preparation, that were not the norm in the modern world. All professions define professionalism. They all have their code of conduct. Selflessness, putting yourself above those who trust you, is not to be done. You are always to put your charges, needs, above your own. Expectation of skill, that you will work to maintain your excellence. There's an expectation of trustworthiness, that in your personal behavior towards those who have given you responsibility, that you will adhere to high standards. But then there's a fourth that the aviators and also the skyscraper engineers have as part of their code, which we don't normally add in what we do in other lines of work. That fourth is discipline. Discipline in following prudent procedure, they say, and in functioning with others. That concept is outside the lexicon of most professions, including my own. But the striking thing is that discipline is hard. I think it's harder than trustworthiness, harder than skill, and perhaps even harder than selflessness. We are flawed and inconstant creatures, and we're not built for discipline. We're made for novelty and for excitement, not worrying about the details. Discipline we have to work at. And I think that's also why in those worlds they've required institutions to make discipline the norm. We have a National Transportation Safety Board in aviation to investigate accidents and find the patterns and make recommendations about what needs to be done. And then we have regulations where manufacturers have to make usable checklists. It's Boeing that makes the checklist for Boeing aircraft. The Airbus makes it for the Airbus aircraft. And the airlines are then required to adopt and to train towards them. And I think it's going to end up being much the same for us in medicine. We will have to have independent organizations that are willing to measure our failures without bias and to recognize the patterns with which we either have greater cost than we should and or lower quality and safety. We will need to reward and change the way we even pay people, to reward and require them to be able to make ever safer processes. And we would need organizations that can track the results. In a sense, it is a recognition we've moved into a world that knowledge has become so complicated that they're embedded in systems. A skyscraper is an entire system that's larger than any one individual's mind. So is healthcare. So is even a car. All of these are made of components that have to be able to work together. And as Don Berwick, the widest ranging thinker I know of in healthcare, has pointed out to me, we in medicine are obsessed by the components. We want great drugs. We want great devices. We want great specialists. But we don't think about how they all fit together. It's like trying to build a car, he said, by doing randomized trials on what the best possible parts are. And so you decide that Ferrari brakes are what you want, and a BMW chassis, and a Volvo body. And you put it all together, and you just get an expensive pile of junk. That is what we feel like, often, in medicine. And so we have now come to a place that is the end of the master builder world. And in its place, the question is what we will put behind. This is our work. And what is striking, I think, about this particular moment is we're within weeks of actually starting on this work. If we pass health care reform, it will be out of an interest in making sure that everybody is included in the system and covered. But embedded in it is also the idea that finally, for once, we have become interested in the question of how we make the healthcare system better, how we make it safer, and how we make it less costly. And what we will find is it will require a kind of transformation. It will require the transformation to move beyond the death of the master builder. I want to thank you for your attention and the chance to explain this to you today.